Good morning. Listening to the words, I believe, of Langston Hughes, I tell you, and the testimony, the Spirit moves. Even for an Episcopalian, it takes a long time. Someone told me something about the Spirit. We need justice for our son, declared Michael Brown's parents after he was gunned down in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri. The justice for which Michael Brown's parents and the other parents for which they wait and weep is not human justice. It is divine justice, the very justice of God. And so it is, in this brief reflection this morning, I want us to ponder the meaning of God's justice in this stand your ground time in which we find ourselves living. What does it mean for us? What is required of us? Now, before I can answer that question, I think we must first recognize that which theologian Gustavo Gutierrez says, and that is this, that all injustice is a breach with God. And that means that all injustice is sin. If our discussion last night revealed anything, it revealed that stand your ground culture, which took the lives of the Trayvons and the Renishas and the Michaels of this world, is a part and parcel of America's narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. A narrative, you will recall, I said, that designates the free space as a white space, and thus meets black intrusion into that space with hostility, and more often than not, with the penalty of death. This narrative, therefore, which deprives people of their lives and deprives people of their God-given dignity, is nothing other than America's original sin. The doctrine of original sin is not meant to suggest the origins of sin itself. Rather, it signals the fact that the human condition is one defined by captivity to sin. To recognize America's narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism as the nation's original sin is to realize that the unspoken but palpable identity of this nation is itself a sinful identity. Essentially, the way in which the early Americans, that is the Pilgrims and the Puritans, as well as the Founding Fathers, constructed the identity of this nation is consequential. It has virtually meant that the nation has been held captive to sin. There have been those who have considered the inhumane treatment of the Native Americans as America's original sin. Others have claimed it to be the enslavement of African Americans. Both our sins, but they are the sins that sin produced. They are reflections of stand your ground culture, which itself is a production of America's grand narrative of exceptionalism. Again, the original sin. In his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln lamented that American slavery was an offense to us all and an offense to God. He said in his estimation it was a sin. He conjectured that the Civil War, which had torn the nation apart, was a result of that sin. He feared, as he said, the judgments of the Lord if the sin of slavery were not removed. Lincoln was right in naming slavery as a sin. What he did not understand was that the original sin that produced slavery, the very exceptionalism upon which the nation was built. And as was also pointed out last night, some 150 years later, our nation is really still divided by war. It is divided by what I call a stand your ground culture war. It cannot be said enough that such a war, it's the war of racism, will continue to reinvent itself throughout history until the original sin of America's Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism is eliminated. The salvation of our nation depends upon it. And this brings us to the justice of God. For the manifestation of salvation from the sin of American Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism signals nothing less than the reality of God's justice. As Daniel Day Williams says, God's justice is manifest in God working to put down the unrighteous, expose idols, show mercy, and achieve reconciliation in a new order which expresses human beings' dignity as the bearer of the divine image. In other words, God's justice means a restoration of the sacred dignity of all of God's people. It means nothing less than healing the breach of sin that is injustice. And so healing this breach means nothing other than the freedom from sin. That is, the freedom from injustice itself. And so first and foremost, church, we should know and understand that God's justice means freedom. Freedom not in some other world, but in the world in which the sin of injustice itself functions. Put simply, if sin is not simply an otherworldly construct, and it is not, but is rather that which impacts the quality and conditions of one's historical life, and it does, then the salvation which is God's justice was not simply referred to an otherworldly or spiritual state or some salvation of the soul. The freedom from sin is that freedom which functions right here. It must be an earthly freedom. Moreover, the meaning of that freedom must always be understood from the point of view of the victims of injustice, the victims of stand your ground culture itself. Why? Because it matters that Jesus died on the cross, just as it matters that God freed the Israelites from bondage. For through both of these divine revelations, God revealed a preferential option for freedom, a freedom that was defined by God's solidarity with the oppressed, the enslaved, the crucified classes of people in the world. That Jesus was crucified affirms his absolute identification with the Trayvons, the Michaels, the Jordans, the Rakishas, all of those victims of stand your ground culture. Jesus' identification with the crucified class is not accidental. It is intentional. It did not begin with his death on the cross. In fact, that Jesus was crucified signals his prior bond with the crucified class of his day. There is perhaps no story that reveals this more than one I understand you heard read last night, and that's the story of Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well. In the social religious context of Jesus' day, there was a long history, as you know, of conflict between Jews and Samaritans. Jews had constructed images of Samaritans as an indecent and ritually impure people. Samaritan women were considered the most impure of all. Multiple narratives of power intersected on the bodies of Samaritan women, ethnic, gender, and cultural narratives. Put simply, the Samaritan woman at the well represented at once an inferior race, an inferior gender, an inferior religion. Samaritan women were indeed the least of these in Jesus' day. Moreover, the relationship between Jewish men and Samaritan women was one of extreme opposition. This relationship reflects in the first century Roman world the antagonistic opposition between white bodies and black bodies in this context of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Yet, as the story unfolds, Jesus initiates a salvific relationship with this woman. The body that is constructed as the most opposed to his, most significantly the body that represents the most scorned and marginalized of his day, Jesus offers salvation. In making such an alliance, Jesus repudiates the narratives and constructs of power. He empties himself, as I spoke of yesterday, of power and privilege and entitlement, all that might come with being a Jewish male. And he empties himself of that, effectively becoming one with the crucified class of people of his day. His crucifixion was therefore inevitable. John Sobrino puts it this way: the cross, for its part, tells of God's affinity with victims. The point of the matter is that it is only when the least of these, in this instance those victims of stand your ground culture, are free to achieve the fullness of life that is theirs, that God's justice will be realized. Their freedom will indicate an eradication of all that separates people one from another, and this thus disengages all people, including ourselves, from the goodness of their humanity. It is only when the lives of the least of these are honored and esteemed in this world, systemically, structurally, and individually, that we will know the justice of God. Their freedom will signal a freedom from sin. And so, what does that mean for us? What is required of us as we move through our troubling present? It requires of us, I think, at least two things, and I'll go through this briefly. First, it requires of us what I call a moral accountability to the past. Moral accountability to the past is about claiming the past that is God in our lives and holding ourselves accountable to that divine past in our very present day. Moral accountability, therefore, is not about ignoring our past, but rather about sitting with it, even when it is difficult and uncomfortable to do so. Sitting with it. So to listen to it, learn from it, tell the truth about it, and allowing ourselves to be critiqued by it in order to discern the movement of God in it. For it is in the past that is God's, in which it is that which we are to claim, and it is that which we are to be accountable to in our very present, if we are to do God's justice. And so, what past is it that is God's for us to claim? Well, it is the past of which I just spoke. It is a past marked by freedom. Be clear. The movement of God in history is a movement marked always by freedom. Freedom from any kind of yoke of slavery that prevents people from living into the fullness of whoever it is God has called them into life to be. Church, the God that calls us into life is a God that calls us into freedom. The life that God calls us into is meant to be a life of freedom. This is what God's past is all about. The past that is the Exodus. The past that is the crucifixion and resurrection event. And this is the past that we are to be morally accountable to in our very present. God's past, with God's freedom, is a past of freedom. Freedom from all the principalities and powers of our world. That is sexism, that is heterosexism, that is homo and trans bigotry, that is racism, that is stand your ground culture. And so, this means most practically that if we are to maintain a moral accountability to the past that is God's, then we as a church, we as a people, must free ourselves from any prejudices, biases, stereotypes, fears, attitudes, practices, systems, structures, and policies that prevent us or any other from realizing their full humanity, their full sacred humanity. Paul puts it this way in his letter to the Galatians. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by any yoke of slavery. The enslaved testified to their own moral accountability when they sang this, "O freedom, O freedom, O freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." What is required of us to do God's justice in our present? We are required to maintain a moral accountability to the past, a past that means freedom. And we are required to maintain what I call a prophetic responsibility to the future. Put simply, as I said yesterday, and so I won't go into much detail today, our present living should always reflect nothing less than a glimpse, a foretaste, if you will, of the future that is God's. I can't say it enough, that our principles, our values, our standards of right and wrong, essentially the ways in which we conduct our lives, should reflect the fact that we believe, not that we think we believe, that we truly believe that there will be a day when the first will be last and the last will be first. Not because of some great reversal, but because the first will be last and the last will be first, because you will not be able to tell them apart. We will all be equal. To live with a prophetic responsibility to the future that is God's is to live into the reality of this kind of human created equality. And so what does God require of us? That we maintain a moral accountability to God's past, to freedom, a prophetic responsibility to God's future of equality. And if we do these things, then we will maintain our divine integrity as people of faith, making known God's ways and will of justice in our very present living. The arc of our universe, my friends, does bend toward justice, because the universe belongs to God. Left for us to do in our present is to act like it and to live our lives with a sense of who God is in our very present. As shaken as I was by the senseless deaths of Trayvon, Jordan, Renisha, Jonathan, and then Michael, and then Eric, and then Tamir, and it goes on and on, I have been even more moved by a mother's faith. These are mothers who refuse to be consoled until they get justice for their children. In her letter to Michael Brown's parents, Trayvon's mother, Sabrina Fulton, said, "We will bond as parents of slain children. We will continue to fight for justice and make them remember our children in an appropriate light." Church, we must all bond with these black mothers. We must all refuse to be consoled until this world is safe for our black children, for all of our children, and until God's justice is done. And thus stand your ground culture with all of its isms has not simply transformed itself, but has been defeated, and that sin has been eliminated from this earth. Some 50 years ago, when Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the Lincoln Memorial, he said, "Now is the time. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children." Now is the time. It is time to live into God's time and to create the world we crave for our daughters and our sons. Now is the time for us to be morally accountable to God's practice, prophetically responsible to God's future, until that new earth, when the time of stand your ground culture is no more. Now is the time, my friends. Now is the time for the justice of God to be made